Service Lab is a community of service design doers and the service design curious. We meet up every few months to share our learning.
So, as you all probably know, today's topic is service design in education. Thank you for signing up and to be here again. If you want to tweet, the hashtag is ServeLab, and as Afsa was mentioning, we're on Twitter. So if you also want to contact us for anything, do feel free to reach out. Today's agenda is going to look like this. We are at intro format and facilitation. We will start to hear from our speakers in a second. We will have Ksenija first, Raj and Sadaf. We will then take a break at 6:55 or less, so that we can all stretch our legs and be ready for the last half an hour. We will have Jean and Paris kind of wrapping up at the end. And that's it. That's how it's going to work out today. Every speaker will have 10 minutes, and then we will have 5 minutes of questions. So while the speakers are talking, please do feel free to add any questions in the chat. We will read them out to them. We might ask you to, if you feel comfortable, if there's something unclear, to specify anything about the questions, but we will try to read the question directly to the speakers. So that's the format. Should be quite straightforward, 10 minutes presentation and 5 minutes questions. So we're just gonna go directly to the first speaker, that is gonna be Ksenija, that I'm gonna make a co-host so that she can share her slides in her screen.
Thank you all. Thank you, ServeLab team, for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be part of this project and part of this sort of session. So my name is Ksenija. I'm a lecturer at Loughborough University, London. I'm also a member of Service Design Education Network, a network that started about a year ago by 3 really amazing women, Jean, Raka, and Katie. And I think Jean is going to present work around the network, so you're going to hear more about that from her. But in this talk, what I want to do is really reflect on sort of my personal experience, both as a child, but also as a academic and educator, and look at the sort of the intersection of service design and education, and the need for innovation in education, and what are the challenges and opportunities that presents. So I want to start with this sentence that educational systems are important. And they're not only important because they support us in getting the next job or just getting a job, but they're important because they have an impact on what we know, how we know it, and they have an impact on our sort of daily experiences. So by having this impact on our daily experiences and being part of such a big part of our lives, I think that they should also develop capacity for innovation. And we've seen this with COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, where the education almost are forced to innovate. And there's some really amazing projects that are coming out of it. But I think that moving forward, we kind of need to think about how do we build in the capacity for innovation in the long term. So I see innovation happening at 3 levels within education, and it's not exhaustive at all, but it's just kind of my personal reflection on it. So the first one is that we need to innovate what we learn, and this is sort of reflecting what was said about the Black Curriculum project. And I think the first time sort of understanding that we can learn different, we can have a curriculum be presented in a different way and can learn different things about the same topic came to me when I was moved from the Eastern Europe into America. And the Eastern Europe education at that time was still very post-Soviet, or kind of very Soviet. And I came into American education and a curriculum that had a very different narrative. And that was really interesting to me. And I had to study that narrative and be sort of educated in that way. But when I took that narrative to my house, my household, where my family, they had the narrative of the sort of the Soviet Union, and the same sort of maybe historical events were presented in a very different way in American education, such as World War II, for example. it created like a real sort of conflict for me at home, because here I was with books that sort of told the truth, and here my parents are telling me, well, this is not how we know it. So I think this is really interesting, and there are other things around sort of what we know and what we learn in school and the universities. Also, there's a discussion around the decolonization of curriculum. So I think this is going to continue to be really relevant. The other one is around what not only what we know and what we learn, but also how we learn. And this is coming from the sort of my personal research that I did during my PhD, and it looked at sustainable education and the need to move towards a more sustainable society. And it was based around the notion that we need to engage with the environment, with the resources, with the just nature in general and Mother Earth in a very different way. It needs to become more relational rather than managerial. The man has to see, or a woman needs to see, or human needs to see themselves as part of nature rather than being separate to nature. So it's a very different mindset, and it's they were relating within the sustainable education discourse to the how we learn. So there's a lot of kind of pedagogy around moving into the woodlands and the forest schools, and this notion of active learning within communities and other things like that. So I think it can be further innovated, and it can be further taken up by a kind of a wider system. And then the third thing is innovating where learning is supported. And this is based on the project that we did at Loughborough University London, where we looked at reflection, and we asked ourselves as educators, okay, well, how can we support our students in their learning journey and support their reflection in their student learning journey? And we really, when we were asking that question, we really just focused within the context of a classroom. But when we spoke to the students and they kind of help us to co-create their own student learning journey and their reflection within that, a lot of reflection in relation to education and in relation to their time at the university was taking place in the sort of before they came to the university and when they were on vacation and holidays with their family, and also after they've left the university. So saying, okay, well, we will be evaluating this and reflecting on the value of education when we leave. And I think this was really, really interesting for us because we kind of thought, okay, well, how do we support that reflection? We don't really have processes for doing that. And also this notion of learning in different contexts, I think is again, or learning at home or online, and I think it's again coming in as sorry, there's somebody coming in. I think I need to admit them. There we go. I hope it's all right. So the context of learning at home is becoming more important during pandemic, and again something that we are again have to innovate to support. So there's the need for, I guess there's a broader need for education to develop this innovation capacity. And I think service design, which is a human-centered co-creative process for innovation that values experiences and values participation, is an important capacity for education to have. But in order for it to move from sort of just working on a single project and making, we need to make it more of a service system capacity, we kind of need to recognize that there is already what Sabine Junginger calls a design legacy. And she talks about the design legacy in terms of the structures, the values, the norms that are already there within the organization, but I think it also relates to the system. So if we were to make service design sort of more of a service system capacity, I think we need to move at how we move, either through design or through service design, through these projects, how we can shape and reshape these legacies within the system. So we kind of, I feel like we need to move away from within education of focusing on processes and outputs, and we really need to start valuing experiences, human experiences, and these are, both individual, like students, communities, teachers, head teachers, everybody's experiences are important. We need to stop thinking of education as something that we deliver and something that and move to start thinking about education and knowledge and solutions, something that we co-create. And this, I think, is again like 3 stars there, is because with the COVID-19, again, it shows that it doesn't matter whether we have technology, and it doesn't matter whether I'm there presenting the content. If that kid, if that student is not there sitting engaged, then there's no education happening. And so how do we promote that? How do we support it? Again, considering different learning environments. We need to move away from valuing and creating hierarchies within education and starting to think about flattening hierarchies. And this is supporting sort of distributing leadership within education and promoting, again, empowering students to take up leadership, empowering teachers to take up leadership and innovate. And also move away from silo services to connected services. And that relates to kind of connecting the experiences as well. So I think that there's lots of work already being done, and I think that the for example, Service Design Education Network, I think there's a build-up of case studies again that can start showing, okay, what is happening here, and how we're engaging with education, and I think it's really great. But one of the things maybe also to consider is how can we then move away from thinking of service design just as a problem shaping and solution generation process to start using service design to also ask some more bigger questions within the system. And so, how can we join with other agendas like climate change, Black Lives Matters and others to sort of reevaluate and facilitate a wider change within education. And then finally, there's also opportunity, I think, for service design and design to reflect on itself and its own practice within the context of education, because it's really complex context. It also seems to be a context where people are not necessarily, they don't necessarily are engaged in that context voluntarily. And I think a lot of service design sort of processes and methods are sort of, I assume that, the user wants to be there. The user wants the service. It's just a matter of making that service better. But when you have a disengaged user and disengaged sort of service provider sometimes, then, what does that mean for the practice? So that's really it for me. But I'm kind of working up a project at the moment, looking at evaluating experiences of K-12 education during the post-pandemic through service design. So if you'd like to talk to me about that, please get in touch. And anything else as well. Thank you.
The next speaker, we have Raj, that I believe is co-host now, should be able to share your screen. And it's going to talk us about experiences from the front line of user-centered policymaking. Over to you.
That old mistake of being on mute. Yes, hello. How do you all do? Thank you very much for having me. So what I'm going to talk about today. So I work at the DFE. I'm going to talk about what our team does. I'm going to give you some examples of our work and some lessons I've learned in user-centered policymaking. It's quite a lot to get through. I've rehearsed it. I think it's about 12 minutes, so that hopefully should leave a bit for questions. A bit about me. This is a picture my daughter did of me. She's also artistic. So it helps, I think, if you know a bit about the speaker and the context that they're from. So I originally trained as a graphic designer. I did a bit of everything in my early career. I did a bit of packaging, editorial, corporate branding. And then in the early 2000s, I met a group of interesting people that were into sort of future forecasting, product design and advertising. And from there we formed a consultancy and applied user-centered thinking to brands, basically. And I did that for 15 years. And then fast forward to now, and this is where I am now. So I'm at the DFE. I was at the MOJ before that, doing a similar thing. This is the team. So we're a bunch of user-centered specialists. So we've got service designers in our team, user researchers, business analysts and policy designers. You may know some of these people. It was started by Joe Silverman, who's in the top left, back in 2018, and Joe and I used to work together at MOJ, working on services for offenders. So we are a policy lab. What are policy labs? So just to give you a bit of context. So the first sort of public sector innovation lab was formed in Denmark in about 2002, I think, and they were called Mind Lab. And Mind Lab's remit was to disrupt, innovate, and experiment from within inside government. So touching on some of the things Ksenija was saying needs to happen sort of faster. But since then, dozens of policy labs have sprung up all around the world. And I guess that's because there's a real need for governments to respond to citizens' needs and demands faster than it ever was before, as the world's changing so quickly. And policy isn't traditionally done very quickly. So it's people like us that are within these policy teams. So within the UK, there are about 20 policy design lab teams sort of working across UK government. The community's convened by Policy Lab, and they were the first ones, and they sit in the Cabinet Office. And the most active and established ones, I think, are probably MOJ, Home Office, DWP, and us at DFE. So what is the Teacher Policy and Service Design team? So unlike other policy labs, we don't work across the whole department in education. We work with a very specific team called the Teachers Workforce Directorate. That's a team of about 500 people. And their responsibility is for teachers only, teachers and school staff. So we don't develop services or solutions for pupils. And we work collaboratively with the team to design policy and services that affects teachers and school staff only. And we do that by applying sort of user-centered approaches to policy making. And we try and look at all the initiatives that go through there with through the lens of a user, essentially. You know, like in this photo, so for instance, you know, but obviously lots of user research, empathy building, proposition testing, prototyping, all the usual tools that you'd find in a user-centered toolbox. And we don't always work on pure policy projects. So our work does extend into services, which could be part of, say, a wider policy. So a policy may need a service, and we help to validate what that service could look like before it's even built. And quite often we're helping the team to understand all the options for delivery. So basically with the aim of designing a solution, like whatever that might look like, that's more likely to be successful when trying to meet the policy intent. And that's the thing we always start with. And sometimes I think of us more akin to sort of a startup within the government. So meeting policy intent, what does that actually mean? So these are this diagram is actually by Policy Lab. There's a link at the bottom if you want to go and see their blog. It's very good. So this shows the different levers with which a government can influence citizen behaviour. So you've got starting at the top, you've got stewardship, sort of leading and influencing, light touch interventions. Sort of around the middle, you've got things that might create market conditions, so commissioning, funding, and then right at the bottom, things like regulation and laws. And these are the ways that a government might influence things. And then that brings us to what we do and some of our work and how that fits into this sort of framework. So first of all, going into sort of the policy problem that sits overarching our work. So the biggest challenge over the last few years has been teachers leaving the profession, as everyone might know. And retention is particularly poor amongst early career teachers. So a fifth leave teaching within 2 years and a third leave within the first 5. That's a huge amount, and we're trying to sort of stem that flow. So much of our work is focused on the problems contributing to this main issue. So the sort of things we do, I'm going to show you 2 projects. I think it's probably only got time for 2. So this was one of the first ones I did with the team when we first started. So how might we encourage more people into teaching by offering teaching experiences? Now, this was an interesting one. So back in 2018, the minister at the time, Damien Hines, he sort of had a hunch that if people had a teaching experience, that made them want to be teachers. Now, I mean, that's not a ridiculous assumption, but it didn't have anything to back it up. And he announced it as part of the department's recruitment and retention strategy and said the department would launch something imminently. So we had to figure out what the hell that was. And we needed to figure out who it should be aimed at and what the experiences actually were. So we split the project into 3 sections. So obviously at the beginning, we did a lot of user research, tried to figure out and identify the best potential audiences for this. Then we took all that learning, put it into a co-design workshop with sector experts, not users in this particular instance. And then we focused on the most likely people, and then created a bunch of ideas around them, and then turned those ideas into a set of, I think, 15 propositions, and then took those back to users to test. And eventually we came out with 3 sort of quite good propositions, we think, that could influence people's motivations to become a teacher. So one of which was coming to the end of its alpha, like a prototype before COVID started. So I'm looking forward to see how that pans out when we all get back to work. Second project, to see how it fits in this framework. So that's that. We were basically building services. It was more of like a marketing building services type of project. So that's where that sits. The second one, how might we improve pupil outcomes through policies affecting teaching assistants? Now, this was an interesting one. So teaching assistants, they account for around 1/4 of the overall state-funded school workforce. That's a hell of a lot. And the department had traditionally had a bit of a hands-off approach to TAs. So they basically left schools to deploy them how they saw fit. And over the years, the numbers were really burgeoning. So we needed to understand what was going on and what they did. And there'd been a fair amount of research done onto the effectiveness of TAs, but none that put their real life experiences of what they do under the microscope. So we basically went into schools, looked at different school contexts, top contexts, and how TAs operate in them, and how they're deployed and what that means for them. So it was mainly user research, convening sort of individuals and groups. We filmed them. We took their stories back to the DFE. We created personas, and it was basically in sort of an empathy building exercise, so ministers and policymakers could see who these people were. And then off the back of that, we made some recommendations, which haven't yet gone anywhere, and I'm not sure they will. But if they did, they might go towards sort of pulling these levers. So there might be some sort of sector guidance on how maybe you might employ TAs. It might stretch to, say, pay structures, and also sort of looking at their qualifications and role, which might be under regulation. So yeah, I think that is the 2 projects I was going to show. And I was really quickly going to go 3 things that I've learned while I've been at the DFE and actually the MOJ. These are just sort of the 3 top of my head lessons, I think, that are the biggest. So I'll rush these quickly. So policy teams in the past have seen us as delivery arms and not collaborative partners. And that's a really easy trap to fall into, because sometimes you're just seen as a consultancy. But basically, it's really hard for civil servants to go on a journey with a user-centered team and everything that goes with that, like the ceremonies, when they've basically got a really busy day-to-day job to do. And it's really up to us as user-centered practitioners to do that, fill that education gap with them and show them the benefits of what user-centered design can do. But I mean, once they buy into that process, sort of there's 2 main things that come out of it, if you're lucky. So, you know, normally when they've got confidence in you, they'll just let you do your best work and approach the problem how you think best, which is brilliant. And then ultimately, the best outcome is if they actually learn the techniques and become advocates. And we've had civil servants become product managers before, which has been great. And they've sort of really got into sort of the whole user-centered design thing. Number 2, the title of a service designer isn't always helpful when working in the policy space. So calling yourself a service designer, I guess, assumes there's a service to be designed, and that's not always the case. And when there is a service to create, everyone can be a service designer, and everyone is helping to create a service. Now, civil servants who were doing the job before we came along were basically designing services. And maybe they weren't doing it the same way as us, but it's sort of their job too. So sometimes the title assumes an ownership that might be a little bit premature. So yeah, it's useful to call yourself something else. And quite a lot of the time we just label ourselves as user researchers. And number 3, and this is the big one, and this sort of speaks to the first talk actually. So government needs to get faster at recognising a wider variety of roles and backgrounds at all levels in policy making. So traditional civil servants, I guess, are very experienced generalists, but for government to really keep pace with society, you need multidisciplinary teams. It's a must. And there is lots of really, really good work going on to recognise different professions and diversities and backgrounds. But it's a really slow process in government to change culture, and it just has to move faster. And I don't know how you do that, but it's something that I dwell on. Yeah, thanks for having me. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Raj. It looks like we have some questions. It was really insightful. So the first questions that came through is, how much time do you typically spend on user research phase? And how do you maintain team morale when you're handed a policy based on a minister's hunch?
Yeah, that's difficult. So that first project, that was, yeah, team morale was low. But when we got to the end of it and we came up with these propositions that would work, we were pretty over the moon. That project took about 3 months. It was meant to be shorter, but it did go on and on and on. So yeah, I think that's probably the longest thing I did. Yeah, you just got to keep the faith. As long as you keep applying your user-centered design processes to the problem, you'll get through it.
Great.
Yeah, so what do you say when you mean a multidisciplinary team? So that's service designers, business analysts, user researchers, delivery managers, digital people, programmers, anyone really who can offer you some insight into the problem who's from a different background than you. The more brains you have thinking about a problem, the more headway you'll make.
Great, we have lots of questions coming through. I'm just gonna pick another 1 or 2.
Yeah, go on.
One that came through from Amelia is about how do you think you might enrich the collaborative relationship with civil servants and ministers in the future? Do you see this as an active part of your work?
Absolutely. So when we first started in the DFE, it's quite a hard slog to try and get people around your way of working, and you really have to prove yourself. It doesn't come easy. You know, they're not going to listen to you just because you go, "Oh, this works. Oh, okay, we'll do it like that then," when they've been working in the same way for years. So most of our projects have been really successful, and we've given them loads of insight, and they then finally see what it means to connect with people on the ground, and you know how much faster you can move when you understand what people actually do and how they behave. We've convinced a lot of civil servants. Ministers are a different matter. There are much more open ministers in government. In education, it's a bit more difficult. I guess education, there are a lot of people high up in education who basically think they know best. You know, it's that sort of quite often that teacher-student relationship is quite, perpetuates quite a lot. So yeah, it's quite difficult. I mean, our experiences at MOJ were different. We were in a different team, and that actually there was even harder. It's basically a DFE, Joe Silverman, he's a civil servant. He's done a great job at helping us interface with all the policy teams. You really need to be linked in with a load of civil servants in your team to sort of smooth that way. Because as a contractor or someone from the outside from a different discipline, you're not always completely trusted. And why should you be? You've got to prove your spurs, really. Great.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through the others. But if you want to scan them and quickly answer to them, or just move this conversation to other platforms. But thank you so much. And it looks like there are also other questions coming in. So please do keep writing them.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to you, Sadaf. Sadaf is going to talk us about what is the role of sense making for secondary school design students.
So I'm looking at what is the role of sense making for secondary school design students. To give a bit of background of why that is, I'm a designer, educator, and entrepreneur. So yeah, this is a little bit of my journey so far. I started off as a designer in the furniture and product design space. So this was largely working at 3D design as a discipline, and throughout my experiences in my career so far, as you can see, the colors of the dots change, so they range from spatial to 2D digital to service design. And I did this to kind of see what the patterns of my experiences have been so far. So I co-founded a studio business, which we ran for 7 years, and I'm working in education for 7.5 years as a technician in the subject of design and technology. So that was a combination of 3D and service. I've led a service design project in healthcare in Pakistan, which had a combination of 3 different things primarily, and currently working on a number of COVID-related projects, which, as you can see on the bottom left, is a combination of all 4 of those things. And so it's just triggered off a bit more about how I see experiences and how they could be combined and how they could be woven together. And yeah, so next slide. Thank you, Yotla. So yeah, that led me to the question of like, what is the role of sense making for secondary school design students? So it's like, how do we feed that back into what design students experience? Next slide. So looked at what sense making is. Sense making is a process by which people give meaning to their collective experiences. And the way I kind of filtered that out was looking at how we do sense making on an individual basis. We do it as a shared experience, and we also do it collaboratively. And when I looked at examples for those things, I also realized that it's quite in chronological order. So when you're a small child, you would it would be related to how you would experience sense making on an individual basis, followed by a design student. And then also, if you work within the service industry or design industry, that's also how you kind of progress in the chronological age stage, but also how maybe your sense making and the tools and processes that you do that with become more interwoven and overlapping. Next. So yeah, so I just like everyone to picture a small child that you know. It might be your own child, it might be someone, a niece, nephew, kid in the park. You've probably seen of how they grab onto anything and everything. You know, they grab it, put it in their mouth, just they're trying to make sense of their environment around them. They will bang onto noise of anything just to see what the material is. And it's basically a way of them to understand their environment. And I think that kind of joy or that sense of, in a way, probably we as adults may think are a bit reckless. They're a bit all over the place. They're a bit, you got to watch them. We may be losing a bit of that that kind of exploratory side to ourselves. And I thought this was a way of looking at how we have experiences and relating it to the next portion of what I'm going to talk about, which is, you know, how does that kind of transfer when you basically are a student and you're aged 10 to 18 years old? If you don't know anyone that age, just go back in time to what you were like as a student in design class. Can you remember what you talked about? Can you remember the projects you did? Did you take them home to your parents, or did you weren't so proud of them? Or like, you know, how did you engage in this role process, and what was the role of you trying to sense make in your experience as a secondary school design student? Next slide. So to kind of give an idea of where that might be, just to kind of help you along with remembering how that felt, is that if you look at a school ecosystem, you have different key stakeholders. So you're the student, so the orange circle, you can interact with, these are just the main key ones. So you have teachers, you've got your parents, you've got contractors, technicians, and you've got management, so all admin and support. Next slide. So now that we understand the kind of key stakeholders, what are the scenarios in which design students learn? There's different ways. Obviously, these are just a few that I've picked out. We've got physical, in person. You've got the online. You've got the art to school environment. Then you've got homework and external visits and local community. So the thing that I'm going to focus most on is the physical in person, because that's just my experience personally working in the workshop space, teaching the practical side of design theory. Next slide. So how does a design student do sense making? There are a few different things, as you can see, that that students will do as a way of understanding, first of all, like their design theory, but also how do they apply it. I think there's like a moment where they know what they've drawn out, they know what they've researched, and then when they get to this stage, they have all the materials in front of them, and then you can see, almost physically see that kind of that disconnection between applying their knowledge in actual practical application, and you realize that there's a disconnect with what they're experiencing and able to manifest physically. And so that's something I was just looking at and exploring of, what are the ways do they do that? As you can see, this is a lot more kind of complicated or a bit more layered than, a small child kind of just banging, eating everything and, just grabbing anything they can. So this is kind of how we are as of this age. So we're looking at how do they use these tools and machines to make, how do they problem solve, how do they use hand-eye coordination and spatial awareness. So you can have the most intellectually bright students, what we'd call bright in academic terms, and when you get them into the workshop environment, they're a bit lost. They don't actually know how to potentially navigate that, where there's problems that might come up or the processes. Next slide. So in terms of the industry, that's, I feel, is where we have the collaborative sense making. We have a certain understanding of knowledge and experience, which we share with our peers. We interact with others through different, jobs, through the people that we're designing with. So we're kind of breaching out our circle of influence in a way and understanding in the sense-making process. So every time we expand, we are gaining another set of tools and understanding to make sense of the environment and what is actually going on. And we share the learnings and approaches in the global space and can be open source. So at the moment, it's like we're looking at how, I'm looking at the COVID kind of related projects, and I've realized that there's a very strong sense of collaboration to reach a collective sense-making experiences and services that we're providing. But what in some of the projects I'm working on currently, they mix and merge the 3D side, the spatial side, the digital side. And I think for me, I'd be really interested to see how that is explored further on as the industry evolves. Next. So there's 4 key learnings that I'd just like to talk about when we're looking at what is the role of sense making for secondary school design students. It's number one is just to be curious and engage in new ways. So like almost like a child does, not afraid. There's that certain level of courage of a small child because they're not aware of the consequences and not aware of, the kind of the dangers, so to speak. And I think as we grow older, we become a bit more cautious and be a bit more reserved in the ways of working and ways of engaging. So that leads me on to the second point, is how might we build on experiences of design students through the process of how they're engaging, how is it relevant to their environment, how is it relevant to the society at large, how is it relevant on a global basis. And the third point is that, like, how do we want to engage? as a service design industry, do we want to play a role within sense making for the education sector? And number 4 is like, if we do, then we can be the bridge that connects design students to the service design industry. And so I guess as a point of reflection, that if this is something that you're interested in, how might you do that? How might you be able to basically bring the circle round and have a full cycle of shared learnings? And yeah, thank you.
We will just crack on with the last half an hour. We have two speakers, Jean and Paris, and we're going to start with Jean. She's going to talk about from higher education, from a higher education manager to service designers. However, did that happen?
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Well, here are some happy students for you to look at. Hello, and thanks very much for inviting me to come along. It's great to be here. I must admit, as a self-confessed admin nerd for most of my career, I must admit being involved in the awards ceremonies has probably been one of the most rewarding things I think I've ever done. It's great being behind the scenes and seeing everything go wrong and trying your very best to make that day so special for the students, their family and their friends. It really is a case of the ducks was floating along the surface, but the feet were paddling madly underneath. So anyway, I want to start out by saying, I think there are two sides to this particular topic. One is around teaching service design, and the other is actually doing it. The two are linked, of course, but I'm very much in the latter camp. So I've had a long career as a member of what we would call the professional services staff, as opposed to academic staff, which I always thought was a bit of a slight on tutors, who were also very professional, I'm sure. But there we go, just one more example of confusing jargon, which is rife in this particular sector. I also want to talk to you about a new community which I've helped to set up, the Service Design in Education, which has its first birthday tomorrow, yay! And say a bit about a key highlight in our calendar, which we are running our very first Edu Jam, which was going to be in the V&A in Dundee, but because of COVID, we're now going to put it online, but I'll be talking more about that later on. So this is my experience, and it may resonate with some of you out there, I hope. I began my career in higher education management in 1982, before we even had computers, the internet, and so much more that we take for granted now, for instance, comms. I come from the days of the reusable envelope, internal envelope. It took a day to reach you from another site. It was 2 miles down the road. And we all had to work to strict policies and procedures so that everybody had a chance to know what was going on at any point across the academic calendar. There wasn't much room for experimenting and innovation in those days, as you can well imagine. So looking back, it's crazy that see just how much has changed in that time, but also really scary to see just how much has not changed and how much of what still happens on the front line today is legacy stuff from another age. I spent 30 years toiling away in admin and management, going through the personal development typical of the 80s, 90s and the noughties, thinking that, as a middle manager, I knew best in a culture of always aiming for the right first time solution. And during this period, I managed many registry and school faculty-based teams, administration teams, covering the student journey from admissions right through to graduation. It was a great grounding, looking back, to understanding the staff and student experience of working across a large, complex organisation like a university, all with the same ultimate goal, of course, the education of the students, but chopped into individual silos, reinforced by top-down management structures and hierarchies, with personal and development targets driving much of the agenda and setting the priorities. Around 10 years ago, I joined an innovative student experience team, which had students as interns working at the heart of the team. It was my first eye-opener. Within a couple of years, I'd come across systems thinking and service design, and then I was able to lead on the university's first soft systems JISC-funded project, taking a service design approach to have a fresh look at student registration and enrolment. Wow. Suddenly all my ducks were in a row. Further JISC funding saw us working with students as partners to identify and scope out sets of key data to identify at-risk students, an early approach to learning analytics and educational development and engagement analytics for student support. Around about that time, across the sector, there was a much more overt focus on the student experience, whatever that is. And I heard a lot of talk about putting the student at the heart of what we do. Crumbs, the number of times I've heard that. It was just knowing it was just so untrue. It's a mantra. It's a bandwagon that people were jumping on. I could see very little real evidence that that's what was happening, on the front line. There was a fashion for creating one-stop shops driven not by what students really wanted and needed, but perpetuating these outdated systems and procedures and processes. Information about services were shoehorned into online platforms which were not fit for purpose. Every department had to have their own web page. Every department wanted their own app. But did any of these innovations directly or indirectly involve students to speak to real need? No means often enough. When I started working with other universities across the sector, as a starting point, I would always ask, what themes do you have coming up in your NSS and other surveys, that's National Student Survey, and other surveys year on year? Are these being echoed in your complaints and appeals department? How are you tackling and monitoring issues students are raising in the programme committees? What does your staff survey tell you? What are your external examiners saying? More particularly, how are you joining all these dots together to understand what's really going on? And I found not only silos on silos, but a nervousness about cross-collaboration, often fueled by reporting mechanisms and target setting. One of the most rewarding aspects of this sort of work for me has been seeing people starting to build relationships outside of their immediate frame of reference and begin to understand how each higher education institution is one massive ecosystem, a community that needs to come together, to act together, to focus on the end user experience. Trying to get to the next slide.
You can click on the screen. You can click on the screen.
That's the one. Thank you very much. If I'm not a tech savvy person, as you could probably tell. There you go. So, not being a tech savvy person, not being an academic, my chief goal was not to publish papers about this work, but I did get a few things out which gained some traction, mainly co-authoring with some academics, and this brought me a few more Twitter followers, and people started getting in touch. One such was Dr. Radka Newton, MBA Programme Director at Lancaster University. You can see her on the right there. And we shared a few very cathartic phone calls, I can tell you. She was looking to help her students engage more with the careers service, and we put together a workshop where they were able to create some personas, do some journey mapping, and they absolutely loved it. Radka herself was also on a journey, and being the powerhouse that she is, she reached out to the Service Design Academy in Dundee. And introduced me to another remarkable lady, Katie Murray, who you can see here on the left. We got our heads together and decided to create a movement to bring human-centered research, service design, and design thinking to the heart of the student experience, and to support those bringing service design approaches to education, be they admin, teachers, lecturers, managers, or whoever. Our very first meetup was in Dundee in June last year. We found we went online due to COVID. We reached a greater audience, and our last 2 online sessions have attracted over 100 people. That's our mission statement up there, by the way, in case you're wondering. In May, we held a workshop to find out what folk wanted from a jam focusing on education. The event was facilitated by the wonderful Andy DeVale from Work Visible, who took us through a series of individual and team exercises to get to the core issues which people are facing in their day-to-day work and life and learning. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with the JAM concept. For those of you who aren't, it's a creative space to explore ways to try out design-based approaches to problem solving and to help build networks, and goodness knows we all need that right now. So one of our key focuses is the JAM in September. Here are the dates. We're not sure whether it's going to be over the 3 days, over 2 days. It's been inspired by the global jams. If you want to know more, please do check us out. That's our website. Sign up to the mailing list and we'll keep you informed of what's going on. Hot off the press, we are twinning with Helsinki, who are running an Edu Design Jam on the 11th of September, which we're all very excited about. If you want to get involved, that's great. If you want to help out and pitch in and make this an event that will really rock, that's even better. So I think that's my time up. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Jane. Gonna stop your screen so that we can see your face.
Okay.
We have a question coming in about what one piece of advice would you give to a non-designer about getting into service design?
Ah, right. Well, that's a really interesting one because I was a non-designer who got into service design. And I think that I just learned, I was just a big sponge, really. I tried to educate myself as far as I could. I had a wonderful guide and mentor in Lauren Curry of Slough, as some of you might know. I also did some work with Sarah Drummond, and she was amazing and so supportive as well. And I read and I watched and I listened and I learned, and basically just tried to find ways to start some small fires in the work that I was doing and trying to get some recognition that this approach does have an impact. And then other people began to get a bit more interested, within the organisation. But I'm still learning, I mean, I've been on this journey over 10 years now, but there's still a lot I don't know. And there's a lot of new stuff coming out all the time, which I'm sort of trying to keep up with, but it's not easy. But yeah, I mean, literally, there's some fantastic resources out there, fantastic books. I mean, people must know about, what is service design thinking. Lou Down has just done Good Services, which has been fantastic. There are so many resources out there that you could tap into.
Great. Thank you, Jane. There's also some nice comment coming in the chat if you want to check them out. Or if you can think of anything that you want to share about resources that you use, just feel free to write it down on the chat if anything comes up.
Okay.
And thank you, Jane. We're going to move on to our last speaker, Paris. I believe your co-host now should be able to share your screen. Paris is going to talk us about how can we give underprivileged students more ownership over their education. Over to you.
Cool. First of all, thank you for having me and thank you for joining, even though it's so sunny outside. So I just wanted to start with a bit about me. So my name's Paris O'Shea. I studied my bachelor's in physics at Imperial, and then I went to Google and worked as a software engineer and then an associate product manager. And during this time, I kind of transitioned from working on abstract mathematical problems to really wanting to work on problems that were close to people. And so that's why I decided to do my master's in global innovation design at the Royal College of Art. And whilst I was there, I had a chance to kind of delve deeper into the types of projects that I was interested in. And I think definitely a clear theme throughout all my projects is working on things that are reducing social disparities. And education tends to be a huge pivot point in this. And so lots of my projects have been around things like curriculum design, education design in terms of systems and service design. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about my most recent project. I've been working on this for the past 6 months. It's called Empower. And the big challenge for this project was figuring out a way that we can use education to tackle child poverty. So before I go into the details, I just wanted to ask a few questions to sit with you. And the first one is, what did you want to be when you grew up? And what did you end up becoming? And what are the factors that influence your answers to both those questions? So is it friends, family, school, teachers, communities? So the Education and Employers charity did a project, and they discovered that career aspirations are set at the age of 7 and change relatively little between then and 18 years old. And I think based on the fact that it's external factors that really motivate the things that we aspire to become, not all career aspirations are created equal. And we actually prepare children from disadvantaged, uninspiring backgrounds who lack role models for careers that actually perpetuate the cycle of poverty. And child poverty is on the rise. So there's 30% of children in the UK who are growing up in poverty, and 37% in London. So that's more than 3 in 10 children in every classroom will be growing up in poverty. And of these children, 1 in 4 of them think that people like them don't succeed. So that's 5 times more than children from affluent families. So there's this clear gap in aspirations and the types of things that these children think they can go on to achieve. And education is a great point in order to overcome poverty. However, the existing education system isn't created equal, and these children are much more likely to become disengaged, with 5 times more likely to become disengaged, have lower attainment, so only 1 in 5 children on free school meals attain good GCSEs, and higher levels of unemployment. So 1 in 5 will be not in education, employment, or training between 16 and 24 years old. So why? What's the answer for this? I think obviously external factors are quite obvious, but if you look at it from the student perspective, what would they say? And I think these are a few themes that I've identified. So one of them is lack of relatedness. They don't see the point in school. Poor relationships between teachers, students, and the environment itself. A lack of autonomy. I hate my teacher. I hate being told what to do. Rote learning, so actually the style of teaching, sitting within a classroom environment, not being able to concentrate. And then low self-esteem, which I think relates back to the aspiration gap that I mentioned earlier. So I really sat with this problem, and I thought, what would education look like if we started from scratch and we considered all these factors, and we wanted to make an education system that was engaging and inspiring for all children? And so the first thing I looked at was engagement, different theories behind engagement and the psychology behind it. And something that came up time and time again was self-determination theory. And this postulates that sustained psychological engagement in an activity requires that the activity must be integrated into the self. So basically this is saying in order to be engaged in something, it has to really relate to your values, you as a person, your purpose, what you identify as important. And then next I was looking at theories around behavior change. So in this case, the behavior change is going to be from disengaged to engaged in education. And this came out to me as ownership by design, which says that to invoke behavior change, designers can use the following affordances: control, you can give the user more control, self-investment, and intimate knowledge around the change. And finally, something that was going to be so crucial to this new education system that's engaging and inspiring is for it to be transformative. So you're trying to change these young people's perspectives and values around education. And the core element of this is critical reflection on the individual's experiences to give new ideas and new understanding of oneself and the outside world. So this idea of critical reflection, really evaluating your environment and the things that are important to you. So I partnered with Feltham Young Offenders Institute as a great place to sort of test some of the ideas and different concepts that I'd ideated. So for those that don't know, there's approximately 2,000 children within Young Offenders Institutes in the UK. And because the children there are below the ages of 18, they have schools within the prisons. And they basically have to provide 30 hours of mandatory education each week. But because of the extreme nature of the students, 90% left school before 16, 67% had been permanently excluded. There's obviously a very high level of disengagement. And so the mainstream approach to education is really not working here in this most extreme case. And so the head of curriculum at Feltham was really interested in this project and looking at different ways that we might change the existing program that they run or their approach to education in order to engage the students there. And so we started to break down what would this system need that the current system doesn't have. And I think something huge is self-knowledge. We don't really spend much time looking internally and figuring out what we care about, what our purpose is, what our strengths are. The existing education system is very much one-way learning. And so I think developing self-knowledge is crucial, especially relating back to the self-determination theory, which is all about identifying your intrinsic motivators in order to make an engaging program. So this is all about discovering self. And then the second thing is discovering aspirations. So as I said before about the aspiration gap, you can't be what you can't see. So it's really important for these kids to understand what is out there, what is possible, and sort of break down those barriers. And so this is really discovery phase, discovery about yourself, discovery of what's out there. And then after that, we want to kind of consolidate these into clear goals. So short-term goals and long-term goals. We want to really define clear things that we want to get out of the education system that this child's going to go on to go through. And then we work with the children and the education provider to design a curriculum that's going to be able to help this student achieve their goals. And then we also have mentors, outside people that are going to help you understand how the curriculum that you're studying is relevant to the world of work today. And finally, we have the delivery of the program. So we've defined the goals, we've created a education program, and now we want to actually conduct it. And so in the first stages, we're going to have knowledge, which the student's going to gain. And this very much mirrors what we see in traditional education. I think the crucial point is the last point, which is application of that knowledge. And so for those that know the Bloom's taxonomy of learning, knowledge and remember is the first two stages, but the third stage is application. And this is where you really cement the things that you've learned. So this process is iterative. You learn more about yourself by experiencing things. And so the more times you can go through this and explore different things that you might be interested in, the more you're going to learn about yourself and the closer you can get to having that really engaging education system and program. And so this all looks a bit messy right now. And so I tried to put it into a nice framework. And after noticing sort of the diverging and converging stages, the double diamond came to mind, which I'm sure is ingrained in every designer's mind. And so this now is a student-centered system. And they go through this process of discovering themselves, defining their goals, developing a program, and delivering on that program. And within each of those stages, we have workshops and resources to help you through them. And then the horizontals is the internal and external. So in order for education to be relevant, we need to make sure we have a convergence between these intrinsic motivators and then the external possibilities and opportunities that are available to these young people. And so all the way through, you have this convergence. And so due to COVID-19, unfortunately, we were able to do the pre-assessment with the young offenders, but the testing of the actual system as a pilot, it had to do with students from mainstream schools. And so I've been doing lots of virtual workshops. And I think one of the key things that have come out from it is gaining confidence, understanding that there's so many things you can be, and not being constrained into this box of school. And if you get a bad grade, it means that you're never going to succeed in life. So I think reassurance and confidence in your ability is something that came through. And then extracting it even further. So the double diamond framework I showed you is kind of an extraction of all the learnings for education providers to be able to apply self-determined learning programs. And so if we extract it even further, what are we doing? We're basically looking at how can we keep students engaged? And this is really important right now, especially as more courses are going online, and online courses have huge dropout rates. And so looking at student engagement, I think, is going to be even more important than it ever was before. And then the other thing is the aspiration gap. This is true for all children, not just children growing up in poverty. So this mismatch between what's possible and what the market demands is going to be really important. And then finally, lifelong learning. We're going to have 3 or more careers in a lifetime. And so I don't know whether you can imagine yourself going through this system and sort of defining what it is that you want to learn and how it is that you're going to learn it. And that's me. I hope I didn't run over too much. And finally, I just wanted to say, if anything I said resonated with you, or you think the framework could be useful for your context, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you and keep the project pushing forward. And that's all from me.
Thanks, Paris. That was so insightful and really quite inspiring as well. Like looking at how you start with students sort of discovering themselves. So that was quite inspiring. So questions, we've got lots of questions. So let's So we got someone from I think Professor Aladdin came 2 hours early, so Mr. Chunk. Very interested in hearing about how and where mentoring fits in young offenders and Google. Okay, there's lots of things in that. Yeah.
So, okay, one thing I would definitely say on the mentoring front is, I didn't get to say this, but an extra detail, so I'm happy you asked. I think mentoring is the huge thing that's missing. So in this system, there's a role of a coach, and so you're kind of switching the roles of teacher and student. And so now teachers actually become much more like mentors, and rather than them telling you what to do, they're sort of helping you invoke the critical reflection in order to make decisions by yourself. And so I think the concept of mentorship is throughout this system. And then mentors at Google. I mean, if you're asking whether we have mentors at Google, we definitely do. And my mentor from Google is actually on this call. So I guess maybe that's trickled through into my projects.
Okay. Raj has a question. He would be interested to know what sort of metrics you were using to measure its effectiveness. Tough question.
Yeah, so lots of studies around transformative education is really about qualitative measurements. And so like this critical reflection and critical discussion, and using that to measure. I think the huge problem is that systems like this are hard to apply metrics to. And that's why public services don't like to do things like this. And that's why it's really hard to kind of welcome this new approach of thinking that invokes self-knowledge and discovery. So I think the metric space is really tricky, because how do you define, I mean, things like student success, right? Or like student happiness. It's much easier to define a grade and say everybody in the year got this grade. So I think metrics don't work as well in this context, but quite intentionally, because I think metrics is one of the problems around the traditional education system. So I think qualitative data is much more important. So if we can find a way to collect that and turn it into a metric, that would be great.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we're just going to take one more question. I'm really sorry I can't get everyone's questions in. Let's take one from Ksenija. Do you have any insight about what makes a good or worthwhile goal with your prototyping?
One of the things I would say is super important, and something that comes up a lot when I talk about this idea, and they say, okay, great, but not everyone in the world can be a musician, not everyone in the world can be an artist or whatever it is. So I think something key is that the goal is related to this like internal, external convergence is related in like an external opportunity or something that's really tangible. So I think that's how we kind of define the goal setting. And also alongside that, the points of setting the goal is also working with people who might be in careers that you're interested in. And so one of the activities that you do there, for example, is you have 5 coffee meets with 5 different people in jobs that you might be interested in. And so then it's like, that's the kind of process behind defining a goal rather than really specific. I'm not sure if that makes much sense, but that's kind of the long-term goals.
Okay. Thanks for that, Paris. Okay, we're going to wrap up now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to all our speakers, Jean, Ksenija, Raj, Sadaf, Paris. We really appreciate you giving up your time. We feel really, really inspired. In terms of next steps, so our next service lab, we don't have a date just yet. So all we will say is watch this space, and we'll let you know. Have a great evening and a lovely week ahead. Enjoy the sun while it's out. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you.